When the foundations are being destroyed, what can the righteous do?
Hi, welcome back. I want to talk a little bit about the family, the first pillar of our society. You know, the family is not any one person's idea. The family was introduced by God in the Garden of Eden. So, if you're thinking about the institution of the family, and we talk a lot about its importance, I want you to know that its beginnings were uh, in the beginning of the Bible. God, after He created the heavens and the earth, He created man, and then He started a series of recreations and creations that had to do with man and it had to do with the garden. But what it was the creation of the family. So if you were to look back at Genesis 2 in verse 7, it says that the Lord formed the man. And in verses 8 and 15, he put the man in the garden. And he gave him a home, in other words. But he put him in the garden with a purpose, gave him a job, gave him a home, gave him a job. And his purpose there in verse 15 was to cultivate and to tend. So he was to work, make the garden productive, but he was also supposed to protect it. He was supposed to keep it. He was supposed to tend it. Um, Now, not necessarily that at that period of time there was need for protection, but it needed caring. It needed someone to care for it, and involved in caring is securing it. So man had a not only a home and he had a job, but he also had a role. And this is Adam. Just the animals had been created. And then it said that it wasn't good for, well, before that, the Lord said to him in verse 16 of chapter 2, he gave him a standard. He says, hey, look, I've created all of this for you. And I invite you to freely partake of anything here. And in the Bible, it uses the words tree. You can freely eat of any tree, except for one. And now, here, God was giving man liberty. He was giving him liberty. And the difference between liberty and freedom is that with liberty, you have standards. See, with freedom, it's like you can do whatever you want. Well, liberty has part of that aspect. You could do whatever you want except this. You can't do this. And that is a standard. And what God created in man was that he was accountable to God. He was to follow God's instructions. And earlier I talked about the foundation or the truth that men have suppressed and outright rejected is just that standard. They don't want God over them. They don't want God telling them what to do. So I want you to see it from the very outset that the family started with this man that God created, and this man had a role. And then it says that man could eat of any tree except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And if he broke that standard, if he disobeyed that command, well, the serious consequences were that he would die. Now, die in that case means that he would cease to have communion with God. he would break his relationship with God, and that God's provision for him would from then on be a provision of mercy in a sense, because man would then have to work the land would be difficult to work, and man would have to live by the sweat of his brow, which obviously was not the case prior to that. And then it says that it wasn't good that man be alone. So in verse 22 of chapter 2, it says that Adam was given a helper. Now, I want you to stop right there, because the term helper means an ally in what God had given man, or Adam, the role that he had. So when Eve was created, she was created as an ally, as a helper. Her role was to be as one who supports the role given to Adam. So it doesn't mean she was less than. It just means that she had a distinct role different from Adam's. Okay, now that's important to remember, because when we start to think about the family, we can't lose sight of these roles. So then God created a husband, a wife. He instituted marriage. You read there where it says, and a man shall not cling to his parents, but he shall cling to his wife, and they both shall be one. That's the institution of marriage. And then after that, of course, they were to procreate and form a family. So Cain, Abel, although they were born in sin and they had all kinds of difficulties, they were raised as a family. Now, what was the purpose of the family? Well, obviously from here we get the purpose of repopulating the earth and reproducing a family. But if you take that further, you're also reproducing a culture, you're reproducing a society, you're reproducing a nation. So out of the family, the importance of family in itself is that it perpetuates life. It perpetuates the traditions, the cultures, all that a family had and made it a family was to be perpetuated through generations, as one family member marries and they have a family, and they reproduce and they multiply. That's the purpose of the family. Second of all, the purpose of the family was to normalize socialization. In a family, children were taught about social norms. You know, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. In a family is where a child learns first how to socialize with other people, because the only people that a child knows as he's growing up is mom and dad, brothers and sisters. So it's in that context that they learn how to live sociably, how to love, what peace is all about, and what is community all about. And this is where in a family is where the transference of values takes place, the transfer of beliefs. You know, the Bible is very, very clear that we're to train up our children in the ways of the Lord. So we're to transfer to them the faith and the beliefs that we have. And then, of course, later on, you know, they're going to grow up to be people, and maybe they'll make different choices, but they'll at least have a reference point. They'll be choosing something else over what they've learned. That's important. Because oftentimes people say, well, I want my kids to be able to make their own choices. Well, how are they going to make a choice if they have no reference? If you've never taught them something, how are they going to make a choice not to choose that? It just doesn't make sense. So it's the transference of beliefs, customs from one generation to another. And also it provides a basic system for social order. It allows children especially to understand social order, to understand roles. Part of what we're seeing today is the destruction of these roles. So kids are growing up very, very confused as to what their roles are, especially in the area of gender. Some of the benefits that of growing up in a family, well, it says that there are better economic outcomes. Children growing up in traditional family have better economic outcomes. They have better educational outcomes. Now, this is not a blanket statement because, of course, we do have single parents, and maybe you're watching this video and you are a single parent and you have made the very best that you can for your family, and I applaud that for you. I applaud that. And I thank God for your steadfastness for your kids and for your family. But it just says that kids that grow up in a family, especially a traditional family, have lower rates of addictions. They have lower incarceration rates. They have lower rates of unwed pregnancies. So all of these things, and you don't have to take my word for it. I'm saying this, and you can all research this for yourself, because the sources that I use here are the National Institute of Health and their National Survey of Families and Households of September 2011. So you can easily find these stats for yourself. In between 1850 and 1960, it's 110 years. Between 1850 and 1960, 110 years. Think about all of the things that happened. Slavery, the abolishment of slavery, Jim Crow's laws, a worldwide depression, World War II. All of these really cataclysmic events and eras that happened during this 110 years. And why am I bringing up 1850 to 1960? Because the rate of kids growing up in a traditional home, two-parent home, two parents that were married to each other, was between 80 and 90%. Between 80 and 90% of kids were growing up in a two-parent home. From 18, that's 110 years. 110 years, 80 to 90%. Where am I getting this? Well, the census started in around 1850. Okay? It was a crude, back then it was a crude, they just counted household. They didn't, but there was a head of house, and there was a woman that he was married to, and maybe their uncles and aunts and grandparents and everybody was living there, but those kids were growing up in a family home. And then, of course, the census started to get more and more systematic, and it was greater ways and technologically better, so that they started really honing down. But between 1850 and 1960, 80 to 90% of children were growing up in a two-parent home, and that's across race and economic levels. Didn't make a difference. Between 1960 and 2005, okay, so now we're talking 45 years, that 90% level dropped down to 67%. And there is some reasons that we'll talk about later on for that. And in the present day, 2005 to the very present, only 57% of kids are growing up. So we went from 90%, 80 to 90% in 1960 to 57%. We almost cut it in half in a mere 40, 60 years. What 110 years couldn't do, we did it in 40 to 50, maybe 60 years. We cut those rates. And of course, the sources for that are the U.S. Census Bureau. But why? Why did all of these things take place? Because the stats show us that our families were really we're in good shape. We had problems, of course, and I remind you that there were wars. There were wars, and there were economic disasters, the depression. All of that was going on. But yet, the family stood strong. The family stood strong. Kids were growing up understanding, and all of those benefits from being in a two-parent home were beneficial to society. I grew up in the Bronx, and in the 1950s, when we first came here, our family was together. My dad came here first, and then he brought us over, and he didn't have even a high school education. But he brought us here, and with the help of other members of the family that were here, he started to work very, very hard. And I remember my grandfather, who lived with us, came with us, and he helped my mother raise us. But my dad was working to the bone, and then my grandfather went out and started working also. And we were never alone at home. We were never considered latchkey kids. There was always somebody at home to make us dinner, always somebody at home to pick us up from school. And we didn't have a whole lot, but we felt safe. We were being brought up. Now, my parents were not overly religious or anything like that, but they had good common sense, and they had very high moral values. And so did the rest of our neighborhood. And, we were Puerto Ricans living among, in those days, we lived down in the Lower East Side, so it was majority Jewish. And then we moved to the Bronx, and the majority there was Irish. But you know what? Of course, there were always differences because there were cultural differences. But we managed to come together. We managed to live in community because we had several things that we all believed in. And we believed in family. We believed in the importance of kids. I don't know about you, but I grew up, everybody around us was like an extended part of the family, because every time I messed up or somebody caught me doing something outside of the house, they immediately let my parents know. And I remember my father especially telling one of the neighbors, "No, if you see him, I give you the permission to smack him across his head." That's just the way we grew up. And there was this innate, maybe it was fear, but there was an innate feeling in my family that I did not want to disappoint my father and mother. I did not want to disappoint them. And I believe that I am today the man that I am today because of the upraising, the family that I grew up in. I'm very, very grateful to the Lord for putting me in a family. Were we perfect? Absolutely not. We dealt with everything that a family deals with, all the weaknesses and all the sins that a family deals with. But one thing that I remember is that we were together. And even though even my dad and mom might have had their even marital problems, but they were committed to the children and to the family. So the importance of family in our society couldn't be stressed more. If the truth of God is the foundation that everything else is built on, then the family is the cornerstone of that building. It is the main building block for everything else that proceeds. It is the family that begins the process of a society. So on my next video, I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that came to disrupt that, and some of the contributions that were made that were well-intentioned, but had terrible outcomes for the family. So until then, stay strong, trust in God, and God bless you. Bye-bye.